Good morning. So I want to review some concepts and clarify my position concerning phenomenology and what it is. I first became interested in it. I'm not really sure how. Maybe because I read a lot. And I've always been interested in psychology. And recovery. And I found that recovery is a universal concept as far as if we look at recovery as a transformation. Recovery from what? A lifetime of conditioned experiences and pattern behavior that was necessarily that was not good for me or anyone. So if you look at it in that way, that's a shared experience. There's no one who escapes regrets or looking at past behavior or momentary behavior with the sense of feeling that they didn't really have control over what was going on, whether it was just emotional changes, variability, being in a certain mood, anger, depression, or sadness, and not being able to change that or do anything about it. So the feeling of not being in control of oneself as a pattern of behavior or a conditioned response to whatever's going on in your life. So these things become interesting questions, especially for one who has come to realize that emotional and psychological well-being and tranquility has become more tranquility, of calmness has become the most important principle in daily living. So then these patterns of conditioned behavior that I'm trying to recover from or transform becomes a study into it of itself. And this is called the mind turning inwards upon itself. So there's conscious, there's two levels, basic levels. There's conscious. You're conscious when you're awake. Your conscious is the seat of your awareness, your ego. The part that you're aware of. It's called the sensorium. The sensorium. It's the seat of your awareness and the feeling of being in the world, or what is it like to be me. So that's conscious. That's being conscious. And when you're asleep, there's a thread of consciousness, of conscious sometimes, when we remember our dreams perhaps. But if you're in a coma, you're certainly not conscious. If you're sleeping, you're not conscious. The second higher level is consciousness. And that's what we're talking about when we talk about phenomenology. Consciousness can be defined as being aware of being conscious and the contents that pass through conscious. So think about that for a second. If your intentionality, which is the total focus of the sensorium, if you could say that my mind, all my perceptions and my cognitions are purposeful and goal-directed. I'm seeking some integration. The mind is seeking integration. but it's split off and fragmented. Even as we see very common experience of different roles we play in different circumstances and situations, we feel as if we're putting on a different role, we're performing in a different way at work, at home, with job, with spouse, with friends, at a cocktail party. The phenomenologist is able to achieve the level of consciousness that will allow him to bear witness, be the witness, and be the listener, the watcher of what goes on in conscious existence, what takes place and passes through conscious perception, through the sensorium. So, in effect, it's a training of the mind to expand the function of the mind, or it has always been there, that ability. Freud called it the superego, and could be understood as stepping back and judging our own behavior, our moral value system, when we judge ourselves. So the mind, we look at our own behavior, our own thoughts, and judge them as moral, or good, or bad. So that's sort of the basic function of it, consciousness. In common parlance, it's called metacognition. So then if I'm aware and I practice this function, this process of the mind, if that becomes my intention then, talked about purpose before, then the sensorium exists to perceive everything. I could look around me, all my senses are working, I'm taking in so much information, I could expand my peripheral vision and just take it all in. And that's, now I have a purpose, my attention. But your sensorium will activate, it's always on, even when you're dreaming, it's always on. It's always seeking, it's seeking, it's seeking. So are we goal-directed? Are we purposeful beings? Yes. Even in at the neural level, the nerve cell, there's the seeking for stimulation, seeking for something. Your mind is never quiet, unless you're in a coma. And that we don't know much about, because no one really could talk about that experience. So we practice this function of the mind trying to understand itself. And if you think that you understand yourself and you got it all together, then I can only praise you. But from my study of human nature and what I see around the world, what I observe is quite the opposite. It's not to say there aren't people who exist who have that level of training or innate skill. I don't believe much in that. I mean, I believe more in training, but so if I train my mind to be analytical, I'm not talking about this sentimental, sappy introspection, talking about critical analysis of human behavior. And if I can practice it on myself, I can certainly practice it with other people, and I think that could come in handy. You could probably imagine situations where that would come in handy. So the idea is I can't know myself without knowing others, and I can't know others without knowing myself. And in fact, codependent and interdependent, co-arising. There's co-arising. There's no self and other. They arise together. identity generated that way, codependent with social concept and personal self-concept. Right back. Let me see the point. All right, so we could talk more later, but the study of phenomenology is studying the human mind and the changes within it. And as evidenced by the changes in your emotional states and your mood. Our mood, our emotional states, and our ego projections. Our projections. You're constantly projecting. You say, I'm never in a bad mood. I'm always happy. Then listen to the content of your speech. What are you saying? Are you judgmental? Do you tend to be self-righteous, judging others, or critical of others? Then that's the outward projection of inward qualities. So you could look at that. If you say, oh, I don't have emotional troubles, then look at the value of your judgments. Usually find this expressed as over-identification with things. And then others who don't have the same identifications, we tend to malign them in some way. That's the universal pattern. So then I could look at that. That could be the object of my contemplation. There's always something. If there's nothing changing, there's nothing changing. You're not really part of living, of life, because everything changes. It's the universal principle. Seeking. Just as the phototropic, primitive consciousness of a leaf of a plant, surface of a leaf, turning towards the sun. Finally, I'll tie it into the practice of the Eastern practices of contemplative practices and ascetic practices, and modern neuroscience. Neurocognition. Is finding a direct one-to-one correspondence with the study of the mind and the benefits of the Eastern practices and philosophies. How to achieve the state of awareness. They're finding that people literally increase their intelligence through training the mind, training this quality of the mind. Because that's separate, higher level of consciousness, the watcher or the listener. It's almost as if it has this quality when you do this. Listen. Listen. That's how it is, the watcher. So if that becomes the stronger part of you, then the smaller self that's carried away by the emotions and the moods and the judgments and the negativity, always finding fault in the world. Do you find yourself doing that? Always finding fault in others during the day? When you're driving your car? Oh, what an idiot. Why did they do that? How could they drive like that, right? And, you know, so projected negative values that have been internalized and then are spit back out. Any critical evaluations of anything usually follow this pattern. So the Eastern practices are to strengthen that area of the mind which is separate and can control, not be part of. It's stepping out of the river. The best analogy is to step out of the river instead of being carried around in those rapids and rolling rapids and tumbled along by it, is the stepping out and observing the flow. Until just pure awareness without judgments becomes a blissful state. In other words, the whole purpose is to eliminate prejudgments and judgments of any kind. To just be aware of what is around you. And you can practice it in the physical world. Look at things without adding anything or without taking anything away. Just with a pure openness. Almost as if, imagine yourself like a baby, an infant, before it learned to smile, how he would look at the world. So no judgments, that's the key. And then, because judgments are all based on past experiences and expectations. So here you are in the past and in the future. Two places you can't be to be aware of right now. So that's part of the practice too. No judgments. Expectations and past experiences. Past experiences organize our perception, influence our perception of what is. Hugely, hugely. We have huge filters and blind spots built within us to serve that conditioned experience and that conditioned model of the world. And every time we're threatened by something, then we get anger and moods and emotions. And we start to criticize. So to be open is much more difficult. Just be aware without judgments. Take some practice, but then it becomes very blissful. All right, that's enough. So I just wanted to make sure there's a link between the study of mind now formally in Western science, psychology, and neuroscience, and neurophysiology. It goes everywhere. Biology. We're seeing these patterns. Anthropology. Things are starting to make sense in a way, as far as understanding the potential of human intelligence, human mind, consciousness. Bye-bye.